Let's briefly talk about the Best Picture winners, which I wasn't a fan of since 1987's The Last Emperor. We discussed I wasn't very fond of Rain Man, Driving Miss Daisy, Who Dances with Wolves, or Forrest Gump. But then I neglected to mention, though it was inferred, there's a period which is The English Patient, Titanic, Shakespeare in Love, and American Beauty, where I feel as though this is not looking good. Gladiator I like a little more, but then A Beautiful Mind in Chicago, not for me. Return of the King, that's very much for me. Million Dollar Baby, Crash, nah. I'm more into Cronenberg's Crash, / Ballard's Crash, let's say. For Departed No Country, we know I'm fond of those. Slumdog Millionaire, The Hurt Locker, The King's Speech, The Artist, Argo, And then we have Steve McQueen's 12 Years a Slave, his third feature film, another entirely impressive venture. 12 Years a Slave was critiqued by some in the American critical press as a film which attempted to be about slavery but was too focused on the tragedy of one man. Steve McQueen, I don't know if he was countering to these interviews, these reviews, these assessments specifically. If I remember, there was a interview wherein Steve McQueen was being very praised by this. It just would have been some television journalist saying, "Oh, you made this amazing film for people to understand slavery." And McQueen countered, "Well, it's not really the story of slavery. That was told of roots. The reason I wanted to tell this story is because it's the story of Solomon Northup specifically." So I feel as though McQueen wasn't really attempting to compose a film. If it's a film about slavery, it's incidental because it's the story of Solomon Northup, which intrinsically involves the American slave culture, the life and miseries which those of African descent were subjected to. Another complaint thrown at the film was that it was more ultimately focused on capturing a certain higher film aesthetic than the grounded, earthy aesthetic of the slave trade at that time, a slave's life and existence in the United States at that time, although without employing documentary realism-esque realism, I think it was an important exercise to demonstrate such. The slave era of the United States has been heavily aestheticized in media since at least the Roots miniseries of the 1970s in the popular imagination, and I think it was important to present that as that historical period within a more highly cinematographic sort of what we might call a festival photographic philosophy in order to, I think, exemplify because sometimes these things aren't real until they're presented in a certain context in order to, in much in the same way that the use of black and white and Schindler's List helps to democratize the situation compared with the films or miniseries that are presented in color, where it seems more of an historical event, whereas Schindler's List presents, there's a certain timelessness to it, wherein even though it takes a bit of there's some prompting from the viewer, wherein it's difficult to imagine the contemporary world in black and white, but I think the older they live, then they see culture change, the more easy it is to sort of pin down a flatline aesthetic through black and white with which Schindler's List becomes effective. But anyway, and an aesthetic like that of high budgeted art house cinema of the contemporary cinematography of the 2010s. I think to see the American slave atrocity as that is I think vital now in order to ensure that it remains relevant and remains an important fixture of contemporary considerations of humanity's capacity for good or evil, for morality or amorality, because I think that, like what the Zone of Interest and Glazer have accomplished recently, it's often easy to associate atrocities of the past as relics of the past, and the media which depicts them fades away, and it's too easy for some films to become relics, like Roots to be considered a miniseries event rather than an act of historical witness, let's say, or simulated witness rather. So 12 Years a Slave exists to learn from the errors of previous productions and to more aesthetically hone in on what audiences need to gain that impression of the era, fuller impression of the era. Understanding an event for a heightened aesthetic can be equally important, maybe not more important, certainly, compared with one which is as clinical and unartistic as possible, well, let's just say. That'd be more reserved for documentaries, as Shoah was to films which came afterward, like Schindler's List and The Zone of Interest, rather than fictional artistic feature films, which maybe they ought to employ some degree of aestheticization in order to exemplify the more psychological, subjective characteristics of these events to some extent, or to finer exemplify their relationship to our present, perhaps. To view these historical events in high resolution is something which audiences have not perceived until the likes of 2013's 12 Years a Slave. And let's face it, unfortunately, Spielberg's Amistad was seemingly not up to the task compared to Steve McQueen in this picture. Amistad, a film which does claim to be about slavery, versus 12 Years a Slave, which, as I remind one, McQueen in at least one interview claimed it is not specifically about slavery in general, rather about Solomon Northup. At the time, I remember there being some discussion about how 12 Years a Slave was going to quite obviously win the Best Picture because it was, the audience members wanted to come across as moral. They thought the Academy might be considered slightly racially insensitive, let's say, if they did not give 12 Years a Slave the Best Picture. I remember this being discussed in some media outlets and on some forums online, which were not necessarily disputing the quality of 12 Years a Slave, although were wondering whether it was an easy win and that there was not going to be maybe necessarily an honest discussion about the best film of the nominees because 12 Years a Slave was amongst them. Here's my take. I think we could argue that 12 Years a Slave was the best film of that roster if it were not for, well, this is always subjective, but I'm partial to Her by Spike Jonze of the nominations here. It's not the strongest lineup. This is around the time they started. I think it was 2009 was the first year they started to employ 10 nominees. And the other nominees, by the way, are American Hustle, Philomena. They're not that great. I haven't seen Philomena. I saw a bit of it. I do like Nebraska, actually. We might discuss that one day. Gravity, I'm very fond of. Look, Gravity has enough problems. I don't think it ought to be the Best Picture winner over 12 Years a Slave, let's say, but Gravity, it has a place in my heart as a lover of escapist science fiction and of how computer graphics can generate these imaginations into something more tangible and thrilling, and which then empower the imagination back in the feedback loop. Anyway, and Her is just, I think, one of the more extraordinary screenplays and visual realizations of said screenplay in the 21st century in general. So 12 Years a Slave is at least one of the 3 best films, or 2 best if you want to be really honest about it, of that year. So it was obviously, it was also up against Captain Phillips, which ain't bad, Dallas Buyers Club, that ain't so bad either, Wolf of Wall Street, which is bad. 12 Years a Slave, share your own thoughts on this film in the comments below. I don't think it ought to be just considered that film that was made about American slavery to acknowledge that it occurred. I think it more importantly ought to be considered a film which continually reminds us that that series of events never ought to be forgotten. If it means a film, an equivalent to Schindler's List, needs to exist for the Atlantic slave trade, which is more about an individual than the events itself, but is by proxy about the event as a whole via one individual's experience, then so be it. And why not it be 12 Years a Slave? It's good enough to meet that qualification, in my own opinion, certainly as an exercise of filmmaking and as a film which really, really enforces what a Holocaust, what a disgusting aberration of the history of the Anglophone world, of the world in general. I mean, slavery is still a constant in some parts of the world. It's an absolute disgrace, and if the adulation of films which absolutely deserve it, and in any case, like 12 Years a Slave, is required to potentially change and move the discourse and the actions and behavior of people globally, the films like this can be nothing if not a net positive, despite what some critics might claim about it. Again, if I may not be considering something, so share your own thoughts on the film if you're so inclined below.